So let's zoom out further from mission into the wider global context. And one of the things that we simply cannot ignore, and you will have noticed it in the trip from the airport to here, and that's the story of urbanization. The story of humanity is the story of urbanization. From the Garden of Eden to the New Jerusalem, humanity's past to humanity's future, we're seeing a process of urbanization, and we're in the midst of the greatest rate of urbanization we have ever seen. In 2008, the human population shifted from being predominantly rural to getting past 50% urban. This is accelerating, as I mentioned. Cities now contain not just the most people in terms of numbers, but that's where the most influence, the most energy, the most creativity, the most development is occurring, is in the urban context. So megacities, more than nation states, are going to be the main influencing factors in the decades to come.
Human lifespans are increasing and human birth rates are declining. This means that the average age of human beings gets older and older year by year. By the year 2050, it's expected that there will be as many people aged 60 and older as there are people aged 15 and younger. Just one interesting example we found recently is this. How many of you have known someone that lived to be 100 years old? Okay. In about 1980 or around the 1980s, there were known to be about 100,000 people who reached age 100 or lived beyond. Now estimates show that by the year 2050, there will be 4 million people that live to be 100 or beyond. These changes are really significant, and they're going to impact all spheres of society, things like employment, things like pensions or retirement ideas, things like the cost and duration of medical care for the elderly, but also our Christian service opportunities, both for those who are aging to be engaged in service around the world for longer and longer, and for us as a church to serve elderly populations in need in every country of the world.
Meanwhile, as the populations of the global north countries actually begin to decline, places like Japan, South Korea, Russia, Germany, elsewhere, populations going down, half of all the population growth between now and the year 2050 is going to be just in those 8 countries. Imagine that, half of all population growth in 8 countries. Another way to render this is between now and the year 2050, we're expecting half of all population growth will be just in Africa alone. So we're seeing where humanity is growing in number and where it is actually beginning to decline in number. And that moves us along to the issue of poverty. And we've actually made amazing, praiseworthy progress in the battle against poverty in this last generation. Only around 10% of the world now lives in what the UN would refer to as extreme poverty. And this is the first time we've gone below 10% in measurable recorded history of these kinds of things. Now, on the flip side, that means over 700 million people in the world are still living in absolute poverty. And where there is poverty, there is injustice. Where there is poverty, there is exploitation. Where there is poverty, there is environmental degradation. Here's another way of slicing this. The 62 richest people in the world own as much wealth as the poorest half of humanity. 62, 3.6 billion, and they have the same amount of wealth. Another way is the 1%, a term you've probably heard thrown around in the last few years, the 1% have as much wealth as the 99%. So 1% of the world controls half of the world's resources. And you can imagine in those kinds of contexts, injustice and exploitation are bound to occur.
So what happens when we get one set of countries with most of the world's wealth, a declining elderly population, and then you get another set of countries with most of the world's poverty and a growing young population? The migration challenges that we are facing today are only the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to see in the 40 years that come next. Migration, probably more than any other factor, will be the context of human conflict, of human need, and the context of our greatest ministry opportunity.